Well, hello, thank you for joining me today again on the Church History Trail, and we're at St Michael's, and we're just going to have a wee look inside. And again you can see the stone, which is 1685, and so we're just going to have a wee walk inside. And there's a wee picture of the church. And there's the Diocese of Armagh, the parish of Donegal, St Michael's Church, CASTLECAULFIELD. And there's the ministers, and as you can see there, 1674 is George Walker Jr. And so that's a whole list then of the ministers of this church. So that's fantastic, as you can see. And so this is the church here. And there's a picture there of the Lord's Supper. And there's a wee banner there too of the church. As you can see, St Michael's Church, CASTLECAULFIELD. And then this here is the baptismal font. As you can see, so this is a pretty amazing church. And I like the windies in it. The windies are fantastic. There's a wee memorials there to the war. That's 1914, 1918, 1939 to 1945. And just in the middle here, you can see 1685 to 2005, which is commemorating the founding of the church. And so this is the front end of the church, as you can see, and that's the pipe organ. And then you can see the lettering on the walls. Let everything that hath breath praise the Lord, as you can see. And that's a fantastic window. I wouldn't want to be cleaning that window, it would take you a wee while. But what we're doing now is we're actually going to look at where the Reverend George Walker is buried. Of course, he was the governor at Derry during the siege. And so who we have here is actually Canon Peter Thompson. So Canon Thompson, thanks very much. It's nice to meet you. And what do we have here then?
You're very welcome, first of all, to CASTLECAULFIELD. This is probably one of the most historic churches in the area. The parish can trace its origins way back to the 5th century when St Patrick came to Donegal and built a church here. And that church existed in Donegal right through to 1641, in the year of the rebellion, and the church was destroyed, the castle here in the village was destroyed, and lots of the buildings around the area were destroyed at that time. The Commonwealth period was a fairly fallow time for churches in this area, but then with the restoration of King Charles II, in the 1660s, things started to take off again. At that stage, the local landlord was the Viscount Charlemont, who lived next door in CASTLECAULFIELD House. And he offered to rebuild the ruined church, but he said he would rebuild it on a site beside his own house. He wasn't going to build it in Donegal village 2 miles away and have to travel down every week on his horse.
And that was, there was a wee alleyway that I seen earlier that leads down to that house.
That's right. There was a private entranceway from the house into the church grounds.
Fantastic.
So he could walk across every Sunday without having to go out onto the main road. And he built this church probably in the late 1670s, early 1680s. We have a couple of pieces of silver, this chalice is dated 1681, the flag in 1684, and we have a few others from around the same period. So that would give us a clue that the church was probably in use by 1681. So it's likely that they built the main part of the body of the church and they were able to use it, and then added the tower on, added the porch on, and it was finished by 1685, which is the date over the door and the date on the floor, and then consecrated in 1687. And it's been in continuous use ever since.
And so these are actually from the 17th century then?
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely amazing. And they look in such good condition.
Well, they're still used every week. They were used by George Walker for his last communion service before he went to the Battle of the Boyne in 1690.
That is wild.
And they've been used by every worshipper here Sunday after Sunday, year after year ever since.
My goodness.
So it's a wonderful link right back to the beginning of this building's history.
Fantastic. So what do we have here then?
This is the memorial to George Walker. Now, George Walker, the famous George Walker, the governor of the city of Londonderry during the siege, was the rector here back at that period. Going back before, his father was rector here back in the 1660s, and then he handed over the parish to his son George Jr. And he was rector here in a number of other parishes, but he lived in a house in Donaghmore on the site of the old church, just a couple of miles away. When he went off to Londonderry, you know the history about being joint governor of the city during the siege and so on. He came back here for a little while and then went off and joined King William at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, where he met his death. And he was buried at the site of the Boyne, and that was the end of George Walker for a time. His widow Isabella lived here, and at some point, I think about 1703, she decided to erect this memorial to her late husband to record all that he was and all that he had done, both as rector of the parish, as governor of Derry, and then his death at the Boyne. And at the same time, she found an enterprising young man from the local area who had been at the Boyne with George, and he said for £5 or something like that, he would go down to the Boyne and bring back the remains. Now, after 13 years, it was only a skeleton, and he came back with a box of bones, which he assured Isabella were the bones of her late husband. I don't know if they were, or they could have been the bones of anybody else. The story is the box has 2 left feet, so they can't both be his unless he kicked with the other foot.
Very good.
But either way, those bones were buried here as George Walker, and Isabella was buried beside him, and a child was also buried in the same grave. So the 3 of them were buried in the Walker plot. The original grave would have been just outside the wall of the church. The area we're standing in was added on in the 1860s to extend the church after the Ulster Revival. So the original plot would have been just outside the wall, and then when this was built, it was covered over, buried underneath the floor of the church.
So this would have been the other side of the church, and then with the extension, it incorporated this.
That's right.
And so the Reverend George Walker then would be buried somewhere in this
under the floor of
vicinity here. Fantastic.
There is an account of the grave being opened and the remains being found.
Fantastic.
So,
and I see George Walker's name there, the Reverend George Walker, and you answered a question that I was a wee bit confused over, because it said coming in there Junior, but you've answered that question because his father was also called George Walker. And it says there also Isabella, and that's, I'm going to ask you a question here because I don't know what year that is. MDCC 111. Just on the, if you can see it there.
Yep. MDCL XXXX 1690.
That's 1690, so, yes.
That was the year of the Battle of the Boyne.
And what's the bottom one then for under Isabella Walker, just at the bottom there?
MDCC 111. That's 1703.
1703.
So that's the year she erected this memorial to George.
Yes. And then the other one is for his death, 1690.
Yeah, 1690.
And just one other thing then, you mentioned the revival, the 1859 revival. What way did that affect this area then?
There was a lot of religious fervour in this area, and the congregations would have increased immensely for a period. We have a tradition in the Church of Ireland of keeping a preacher's book, and that book records the numbers of people attending Sunday services, and the number of communicants and so on. It tries to give a bit of a snapshot of the history, and over time it gives you an indication, is the church growing or dying, or what's happening in an area. And in those years, in the 10, 20 years even after the Ulster Revival, the numbers here were phenomenal. The preacher's book records on one particular Sunday over 700 in this building.
My goodness.
The church only seats about 300, at a push 350. They describe children sitting on the steps and people sitting on the floors, but even with that, I suspect that maybe they looked at last week and said, well, last week we had 500. There's more than last week. It must be 700. I don't think they really went round and counted each individual head and said, there's definitely 700 here. I think it was a bit of wishful thinking and guesswork. But it certainly gives a picture of a huge revival in faith and in practice in a very small village, to see the church packed. And the Methodist church a couple of doors down the road and the Presbyterian church beside that, all of them would have been filled to overflowing every Sunday. And in this church, we had to build on the 2 transepts and the sanctuary to cope with the additional number of people coming.
Fantastic. And then I remember reading back, I can't remember when it was, but when I was doing a wee bit of history at CASTLECAULFIELD and it was talking about John Wesley, am I right in saying that before the Methodist church was built, that I think it was 1886 it was built, but before that they worshipped, they got the land of the Presbyterian church. Would you know anything about that?
I think they worshipped for a time in the ruins of the old castle.
Oh, the old castle, was it?
When Wesley came here, he preached in the grounds of the castle. There's a lovely open green space there, which would have been used for public gatherings, meetings, and open-air preaching. And Wesley preached there. And at least for a time, there was a part of the building was re-roofed. And I know the Methodist congregation met there. I'm not sure as of what happened after that, between that and building their own church. But they certainly met in the old castle building for a time.
And just to finish off with then, I was at the service tonight, and you're a very gifted musician. How long have you been playing, and also where did you learn?
Well, I studied for 3 years in the Royal Irish Academy of Music in Dublin, and then another 3 years in Queen's in Belfast. And I learned, I suppose, in both of those. I played the organ in St Anne's Cathedral as an organ scholar when I was in Queen's, and then went off to theological college to train for ordination, and didn't have much time to play, so I gave up. I would have played for an occasional wedding or a funeral or maybe a Sunday morning, but not any professional level playing. Then about 12 years ago, I was involved in the cathedral in Armagh. I was a vicar choral and helped out in the choir, and the organist there had a bad back, and he rang me up one night and said, I'm heading to hospital for 2 weeks for some tests to find out what's wrong with the back. Is there any chance you would play for a couple of evensongs and take the choir practices for a couple of weeks? And I said, well, it's nearly 10 years if I've played anything properly. I don't think I could do it again. And he said, well, there's nobody else. And he cajoled and convinced and talked me into it. So eventually I gave in and said I would do it for 2 weeks. And then I got a call from the dean saying it's going to be 4 weeks. And then 4 became 8, and 8 became, well, as everything in church, a permanent appointment.
And you're still doing it?
It's 13 years on, and I'm still playing there. I'm the assistant organist. I play there every Sunday afternoon for evensong.
Fantastic. And I'll just give you a wee look again at the what's the name of the, it's the chalice, what?
This is a chalice.
Chalice
and this is a flagon.
And the flagon. And amazing to think that that's actually from the 17th century. Unbelievable.
The other thing we have from George Walker's period, you probably haven't spotted it because it's under a pile of music at the far side, which it shouldn't be, is the old font.
Oh.
The original, the church was completely different in the late 17th century. The pews met in the middle. There were 2 aisles either side, gas lamps down the middle, a small wooden altar with a horseshoe-shaped rail around it, and a wooden pulpit and a wooden prayer desk.
Would it be possible to see that font?
Sure. In 1909, we'll walk across and I'll keep talking.
That's great.
In 1909, the Burgess family, who were the local landlords, decided to renovate the church and try and change the interior look of it all. So they separated out the pews and created one central aisle. They put in these marble steps and the wood panelling in the sanctuary, the new prayer desk, pulpit, and the font at the back, all to match, and gave the church a very different look and feel and dynamic from what it had in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And they threw out the old furniture. The old wooden pulpit went at one stage to the Methodist church next door, where the legs were taken off because it was too tall. It was on a big pedestal to see into the gallery here, but it's a much smaller building. And eventually it ended up in the local Black Hall, and the legs were turned into a chair for the worshipful master of the lodge, and the pulpit's still there. But the old font was thrown out, and sometime in the 1930s, a local farmer found it in a shuck and realised what it was and thought it was an awful shame to see it lying out and being exposed to the elements. And so he brought it back and gave it to the church.
Fantastic.
It was put into the back porch for a number of years. And then when the porch was being renovated to create kitchen facilities, it was put up here beside the pulpit.
So this is it here
This
then?
is the original font
My
from
goodness.
the late 1680s. This is the font that Walker would have baptised his own children in,
That is wild.
and the font that was used throughout the history of the church up to 1909.
That is incredible, isn't it?
It's just still here as a little part of our history and our heritage. And sometime we might figure out how to display it a little bit better, what to do with it. But for now, we're just keeping it safe and making sure there's no damage comes to it.
Well, whoever watches this video on YouTube will certainly see it, so I can guarantee you of that. So thank you once again, and I trust that the Lord blesses your ministry and increases your ministry here. And thanks very much for talking with me. And so if you enjoy the video on the channel, then please like and subscribe. God bless.